Welcome to the Get Real Movies podcast. My name is Daniel Chadwick Schubat. I'm your host, and this is episode 23, where we will be chatting about the new release, Deeper, as well as 13 Lives. To join us to talk about these two films is the subject of two of these films, and that is Dr. Richard Harris, commonly known as Harry to most of his mates and anyone who he chats to more than a few times. So I do call him Harry a few times in this podcast. It is not another person, I promise you. But Harry was just wonderful to chat to about these two films. Deeper was a documentary that had its debut at South by Southwest and will be playing at the Sydney Film Festival in June. So if you are in the Sydney area or are planning to travel there, I do highly recommend you checking out that film. It is a wonderful documentary all about his lifelong obsession with the Pierce Resurgence, a deep cave in New Zealand, and his journey to conquer it and to put it behind him. And it was just a really kind of wonderful character piece, which you don't see often in documentaries, especially ones that are on subjects that are still alive. So I really appreciate that, and it was something different. And then later on in the podcast, we talked about 13 Lives, which is the movie about the Thai cave rescue, which he was quite heavily involved in as well. We talk about what were some of the inaccuracies, what were some of the things that they Hollywoodized, and how did he feel about Joel Edgerton playing him? Because if I had Joel Edgerton playing me in a movie, I'd be pretty happy. But let's see what Harry has to say about it. So without much further ado, here's my conversation with Richard Harris. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Harris. Today we'll be talking about the Deeper documentary, as well as a little bit about 13 Lives. Today it's the rare moment I get to talk about two films with you, the documentary and then the film as well. I'd love to start by asking you, what makes deep cave diving such a big part of your life, and why did you fall in love with it at such a young age?
It's a very good question. Most people can't understand why you do any kind of cave diving, to be honest, let alone that niche which we've developed an interest in, which is deep cave diving. But I guess to wind back the clock a bit, I'm 60 now, and I started cave diving in 1986 and started normal open water diving about 7 years before that at the age of 15. So diving and being in the ocean in particular has always been a big part of my life. It started out with family friends and growing up and going on summer holidays to beach locations around the state of South Australia where I live. And I always knew that being underwater was going to be a big part of my life. I was a diving instructor at university when I was at medical school in our university dive club. And a bunch of us sort of got a bit bored, I suppose, and decided to go off and try some freshwater diving, which in the state of South Australia is in an area called Mount Gambier, which is only 4 or 5 hours drive from home. And so I found myself down there learning to cave dive. And I guess that was the start of this lifelong passion or obsession, some might say.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned it early on in the documentary. You weren't into the generic sports, and this was something that you loved doing. But one thing I really loved about the documentary about Deeper is it really explored your relationship with your father a bit, and he was not as understanding about it as you know, maybe many fathers would be, because it's quite a dangerous one. So I'd love to hear about when was the moment where he started taking this seriously, because you talk a little bit about that in the documentary as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it became a bit of a running joke between me and my father because he was a fairly adventurous lad. I'm sure he was quite good at sports, and like most normal young men and women, perhaps they find their release or their appetite for a bit of risk on the football field or with contact sports or by running and jumping and catching and kicking, all the things that I wasn't particularly good at, even though I tried them all at different times. And I wasn't terrible, but I was very, very average. But really, I didn't enjoy it that much. I like being part of a team, but I never felt like I was really contributing enough to justify my place there. So I kind of found my fun in more solo pursuits, really, in the bush, bushwalking, camping, fishing, diving and found a smaller group of people who enjoyed those same things. And through that, I think I found a very close group of friends, as hopefully is portrayed in the film Deeper. We've got this little group of friends who have been diving and exploring together for many years now, and we've really built this very tight trust and bond to do some of these projects. But back to my father, he was obviously anxious, as anyone would be, for one of their children who is pursuing something that has clear risks involved, whether you're a mountain climber or a cave diver or a base jumper or, something that obviously has a danger associated with it. But I also think he trusted me. He knew that I was very experienced and very cautious in my approach. I often draw the parallel between my daytime job as an anesthesiologist and my interest in cave diving, because there is quite a lot of similarities. Both of those things have obvious hazards. In anesthesia, it's for the patient, of course, not for myself. But you treat that risk very seriously, and you can mitigate that risk by being well trained, by being very cautious, by having checklists. And the same applies to the pursuit of cave diving. You can have successful outcomes and keep yourself safe if you follow that kind of mental model.
In the film, there's one moment where I think you name drop Edmund Hillary, and I was like, wait, okay, I'm getting a little worried now if we're name dropping Edmund Hillary. But I do see the parallels between climbing a place like Mount Everest and then diving the cave that you wanted to dive in New Zealand, Pierce Resurgence. So I know this was almost a decade long or longer than that, 16-year long pursuit for you. So what drew you to this specific cave in the beautiful country of New Zealand?
It's funny talking about Edmund Hillary. I don't remember making that specific comment, but that was also been a running joke with my wife that, I would say, what would Mrs. Hillary have said? What would have Edmund done if Mrs. Hillary had said, you can't go and climb that mountain? History wouldn't have been made. So I think adventurers often use humour to try and diffuse the sense of risk and danger to their loved ones. I've certainly done that. Of course, I'm sure I'm completely transparent, and that hasn't worked in any case. But anyway, New Zealand, why this particular cave? Well, the main reason is pure and simply that it hadn't been explored. And for cave divers, that's really the holy grail, to find a cave that has either not been explored at all or has been incompletely explored. And so to be the first person to swim or walk or climb into that part of the cave, which that you are the first set of human eyes to lay your eyes upon, that is overwhelmingly addictive when you start doing it. When you start to what we call scoop booty in a cave and be that first person to basically walk around the corner or swim around the corner and say, forevermore, I will be the first person who has ever seen this piece of passage. Now, of course, it may just look like any other tunnel full of rocks and water, or in a dry cave, just rocks and air. But there is something remarkably special about being able to do genuine original exploration in this day and age compared to even 50 or 100 years ago, when people were pioneering routes up mountains for the first time into jungles or to outer space even. And it's harder and harder to do as a human in this day and age. And caves remain one of the last places where it's actually still quite possible to do so. And deep caves, whether they be dry caves or water-filled caves, have added difficulties, added logistics, added risks, and an added requirement for greater knowledge to safely explore them. And so for myself and my friend Craig Challen in particular, the idea of deep diving has in and of itself become quite interesting to us, to how to work out how to safely overcome the physics and the physiology and the psychology of pushing yourself through those boundaries and to do it safely. So for both of us, I think we look upon this as a huge cerebral challenge as well as a physical and psychological one to work out how to safely approach these problems. And it's taken us that 16 years to basically gradually work our way down to deeper and deeper depths to try and overcome these hurdles without hurting ourselves.
You mentioned your wife at the start of that, and I really loved her being part of the film, because you kind of got that other side of how people might view deep cave diving, and it's really clear she trusts you and she loves you, but there's still that worry about this is my family and they're going into a spot where they could die instantly and I wouldn't even know about it. So before you go on these excursions, these ventures to explore things that have never been explored before, is there like a routine that you guys have, or something that you do that just kind of puts you both at ease, or is it more sort of you go and then you come back and that's it, sort of a thing?
Yeah, I don't think there's any routine in the world that would put Fiona at ease when I'm going to the Pierce Resurgence. And
For sure.
there's more. It's more than just the fact this is a very deep, cold, dark cave that's difficult to explore, and there are obvious dangers. The biggest problem for her is it's very remote, and there's no communications really when we're in the site. Even satellite phones only work very intermittently because we're in a very steep sided valley, so you have to wait for a satellite to go over. So it's not reliable enough for me to keep in touch with her while we're away. So basically, she sits at home for 2 to 3 weeks whilst I'm in the bush there, and she knows that at some point, especially late in the trip, we're going to be doing what we call the push dives when we're actually trying to get to the point of ongoing exploration and beyond. I think as we've gotten older and we've had children and the children are growing up, and she's found that every year to be more and more difficult, that period of time, especially those few days when she's aware this is probably happening now. And kind of every time the phone rings over those few days, she's thinking, oh God, is that going to be bad news? And so, this has been a very selfish pursuit for me over a long period of time. And I can't even explain the level of gratitude I have to her and my family for allowing me to do this, to fulfill my own goals and my own personal needs, I guess. And I recognize how selfish it is, but it's become this addictive obsession. However, I don't want to spoil the film too much, but clearly, I survived. I'm back here talking to you, and we produced a film. So, but I did make this promise to her that that would be the last trip, and I wouldn't go back to that particular cave. But not to say I wouldn't go to a different one, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when we originally were trying to chat back when you premiered the film at South by Southwest, which I'd love to ask you about in a moment. You were out of service somewhere diving or doing something, so obviously it's something you still actively pursue and enjoy. It's just that specific challenge has been conquered, I guess.
Well, it hasn't been conquered, sadly, and there's a little void in me which calls to me a lot. But I won't go back to that particular cave particularly because of the problems with communication, and particularly because it has become a bit of a bogeyman for Fiona and the family. So no, that cave's done and dusted for me. Even though I would love to find out where it goes and to make that connection that we know which goes through to another cave further up the mountain. But no, that's for the next generation now.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the film, and I really like that. And you also mentioned Craig, who is another main part of the film. But I think you mentioned that sometimes it's selfish, but I also feel, at least that came across in the film, that it's very much about camaraderie. It seems the bond all these divers share. I think earlier on in the movie they mentioned that deep cave divers can sort of be loners sometimes, but you all found sort of a group where you could be yourselves and be together, and I think that was a real big part of the movie that shined through to me, was the camaraderie. So I'd love to actually hear first of all about South by Southwest and debuting there and what the response was like. But then I guess the second part of that question is I'd love to hear about the camaraderie within the group, because that really shined through.
Yeah, the film. How can I say it? The film is different to what I set out to make when I first started diving this cave. I wanted to produce a film about the technical aspects of cave diving, the exploration, the physiology, the science, and the camaraderie, the stuff, the teamwork that goes into doing these exploration dives, without touching too much on the personalities and the personal aspects of this. I guess I was still in the cave diving cameraman mindset, which is what I am. What I love doing is carrying cameras underwater. And I just wanted to show the rest of the world what this amazing place was about and why it's important to us and what we're achieving. The mountain genre is so good and so watchable, and I love every new mountain film that comes out. But I feel like I've kind of seen them all already, even though everyone is still great. And we're not going to the top of any new mountains, really. We might be doing it in a different way, and in some ways still doing a world first, or certainly, the grit and determination and courage and hardship that high altitude climbers face every time they do one of these climbs still resonates in the film. But I thought, what if you could show all that and find something that no human's ever seen before? And that's what we can do in a cave. Of course, you don't have the cinematic views and the beauty that you get on a mountain slope. And so I was probably fooling myself that we could ever make something that would be as charismatic or as, would resonate with the general public as a great mountain film. But that's what was in my mind. Anyway, so we did this expedition and I came back with some great footage. I took these two amazing cameramen with me, and we knew we had a great story because the expedition was so difficult and so fraught with problems and peril. When everything goes wrong, but you still achieve your goal at the end of the expedition, you've got a good film as long as you've captured it. And so I sought out a storyteller who could craft it and put it together for me. And that's when I approached Jennifer Peetham from Stranger Than Fiction Films, the director. And she, of course, is an incredible storyteller, which is why I approached her and why I trusted her to make the film. And she turned the whole thing around on me and made it this character-driven story, which primarily focused on myself, which was kind of never the goal. It was supposed to be about us, the team, our friends. And now I find myself kind of at the center of this film with my friend Craig. So having got that discomfort kind of out of the way and dealt with, I now see the film for what it is, which I think is so much better than anything I could have prophesized or created myself, because I don't think 99% of the public are particularly interested in how to do a cave dive. 101, you need to like the people or dislike the people or want to follow their journey, which I think Jen has done an amazing job in creating. So with that all said, going to see the premiere, because I was still kind of conflicted about what the film was, and I felt a little bit exposed, I have to say, putting myself out there in such a personal way in the film, which is something I'm not comfortable with. Jen was great at cajoling me and getting me to open up. But I think a lot of people will look at characters like myself and Craig and go, they're not the typical people that a lot of Americans will perhaps connect with straight away, because we're not very exuberant. We don't sort of talk up the stuff we're doing much. We're pretty quiet and reserved, more like the British perhaps, going about what we do with a bit of sarcasm and tasteless humor at times, I'd say. And so I really didn't have a feeling as to whether this was a good film or not, and what the audiences would think. And when you sit there in the theater with the premiere running and you're looking around, you still don't really have a sense of what people were thinking. All I can tell you is that the audience was very quiet, very absorbed, I think, during the watching the film. And the Q&A at the end of it was really, really good and robust and interesting. But people are very polite. So how do I really know what the film is like? I'm not sure that I do, apart from some of the reviews that have come back, which have been great. But time will tell, I suppose. One day you'll have to tell me, Daniel, whether it was any good or not.
Well, I could tell you that you made it seem very ordinary what you were doing, and it's very extraordinary. And I think that's some of the charm of the film, is that you're doing something that's just so far-fetched for me. My dad loves saying whenever we're watching a movie that's not based on a true story, this is so far-fetched. And I remember when we watched 13 Lives, he even said in that moment, he was like, this feels very far-fetched, because it was just such a crazy story. And I think this is very, very similar. But a lot of my friends who are at South by Southwest, I didn't get to go, sadly, but they all did see it, and they had no bad things to say about it. So that's usually, I feel like, when you've done a good job with a film, where you don't hear a bad thing about it online and you don't hear a bad thing about it word of mouth, because that's what I trust mostly, is when it comes to people who I know watch a lot of film and enjoy it, and like you said, it was something new. And it is difficult to film those underwater shots, but I think you guys did a fantastic job, and you made it very watchable, and I was going to say very funny as well. I think one of the moments that sticks out with me is when you and Craig are coming up, and I guess we'll explain this to the audience. When you're coming up from a deep cave dive, you can't just go right up, because then I don't know the science behind it, but essentially you say you would lose all bodily functions and die very quickly, and it would be a very horrible death. But I think there's a moment where you're at the 16-meter mark, and you can finally talk with the people up there, and it's like you're doing a little podcast together in there, and you're just laughing and giggling. And I was just like, man, I would just be freaking out if I was still 16 meters in the water and I just have to wait there until my body depressurizes so I don't die. But you were just both so blasé and so chilled out about it, and I think that's what made it so watchable, is that everyone from I think is Big Dave, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and
Big Dave.
and just everyone seemed to have a yeah, everyone seemed to have a different character and a different sort of, I guess, approach to the movie, and but they were all acting like themselves. And I've realized that's the best when it comes to podcasting or filmmaking or any part of life. If you're just yourself, usually you'll find something good in it. So, anyways, I feel like I talked too long, but yes, I very much like the film.
No, that's good. And yeah, that moment you're talking about, we have to decompress to get gas out of our body before we can come all the way to the surface, and we stop at different points on the way up. And on these very deep dives, that takes up to 16 hours in some of the dives we've done. So it's a very long process, and it's very boring, it's very cold, and it's very uncomfortable. So, but by the time if you've been down to 230 or 40 meters or wherever you've been, where it's absolutely terrifying to be down there, and you're back at 16 meters, you actually feel like I'm actually going to survive this, and you get this huge release of fear and worry and the build up and the tension of the past couple of weeks that's been waiting for this moment. And we've had some hilarious moments at that moment when you do start to relax. And we do a thing called Happy Chat, because we're in these little habitats, little underwater upturned buckets where we can sit in there and take the mouthpiece out and chat to each other. And we'll sometimes record them on a GoPro and send them to our friends who are doing similar sorts of diving in different parts of the world. And so we've got this international Happy Chat thing going. So that was just a fairly routine moment for Craig and I. And I think Craig was doing some of his new rapping that he'd been working on for that moment. So yeah, it was good times.
Yeah, if you ever decided to, I understand that you have a podcast, but if you ever decided to start another podcast and it was just happy chats, I would tune in every episode 100%.
Yeah, you've got to look death in the eye before you feel relaxed enough to be that funny, though. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I guess in terms of this film, I think it had a really beautiful ending. And, I guess I won't get too much into it because I do want people to watch the film. But I'd love to know, so you talked to Craig and you started talking about your next adventure. And I don't know if that's decided yet or if you're in the middle of it, but what is your next adventure?
Well, I won't say too much about that yet until maybe the film's had a wider release, because, yeah, I don't want to spoil the ending. But there is a postscript
Okay.
to it all, which will no doubt come out once we start talking at the various other film festivals, and when it finally gets a release of some kind, that we're still waiting to hear what nature that will, or what form that will take. But yeah, plenty of diving going on. I'm doing more and more underwater filmmaking, either freelance as an underwater cameraman
Awesome.
or doing some of my own small productions, just documentary stuff about anything to do with water, science and conservation stuff primarily. So that's really good. It's all starting to take off for me. So, life is pretty good, Daniel.
That's good. I'm really glad. That kind of takes me into 13 Lives a little bit. I'd love to chat to you about that a little bit because it's actually within the film. You say that you don't really like attention, and it was kind of thrust upon you because you did your job. And I guess that takes us into the moment that people know you for, or that you became more known worldwide, and that was the Thai cave rescue dive that you did with Richard Stanton and a bunch of other people, including Craig, I believe, right? Craig was there as
Yeah,
well.
that's right. Yep.
And I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the film, but first, more in a generic sense, when you saw the film come out, how do you think it did in terms of representing the facts of of that, because it seemed to be presenting it in a pretty straightforward and to the truth way, mostly because it's such an unbelievable story that I feel like it would be hard to sort of deter from, what actually happened, because even Hollywood, I don't think, could dream up that much of a crazy situation. So I'd love to hear a little bit about this rescue dive, and how you were brought in on it, and then a little bit of what you thought about the film.
Well, in terms of the rescue itself, in 2018, June, July, I was working here in Adelaide as an anesthesiologist, but I also was working in a couple of different areas, working with the ambulance in a kind of rescue retrieval format, where flying out in helicopters to road accidents, or as basically anyone who's critically ill in a remote area away from the big hospitals, and then we'd deliver intensive care or tertiary hospital level care to them and bring them back to the hospitals here in Adelaide. And I also had a long-standing interest in cave rescue itself, and had been running some training for that, and had done a fair bit of scenario training around the idea that someone could get stuck in a dry chamber, but had to get through a water-filled cave to get back to the surface where they would be able to be assisted. This whole thing turned out to be pretty bespoke rescue for my skill set, with the requirement for anesthesia in the end, cave diving and cave rescue in general. So when I heard about these boys being stuck in a cave in Thailand, which of course is kind of in our patch here in Australia, I immediately had a sense that I was going to become involved with it, and to the point where I actually was trying to get myself over there, because I had this real very ingrained sense that I needed to be there to do something. And finally, when the boys were found by Rick Stanton and John Valanthan, with the help of obviously a lot of other people over there, Rick and I had been communicating because we knew each other from the Pierce Resurgence, actually, the cave in New Zealand, and another couple of expeditions. And Rick proposed this idea of anaesthetising the boys to bring them out, because he could really think of no other way they were possibly going to come out alive. So on that basis, I went over to Thailand, even though I thought that was a very, very bad idea, and the fatality rate would be essentially 100% if we tried to do that. But after being there for 24 hours or so, I realised actually he was correct. There was no other way. These boys would either die in the cave, or we could try this thing, which I felt would have a very high mortality rate. And as history relates, we somehow managed to do it over 3 days and got all 12 boys out with their coach. Despite this being completely unprecedented and untested technique, we made it happen. So it was a remarkable thing to be involved with. I felt incredibly privileged to be part of this global team that came together to help these kids. Tens of thousands of people, almost 10,000 just around the mountain itself or inside the mountain. It was an extraordinary thing to be part of. So inevitably, that very quickly led to interest from publishers and film companies. And, we came home to this completely different world where Craig and I were the centre of a big focus from the media in Australia. And it was really completely unwanted, unrequested, and unexpected. And so we hid from it. We went off caving. We went out to the centre of the desert in Australia, where we had some caves, and we stayed out there for a couple of weeks. And then we went off to Canada, to a remote area, to go caving. And, it just got worse and worse every time we tried to hide from it. So in the end, we had to suck it up and start to engage a little bit more. And to be honest, that's been life-changing for me. It's allowed me to just recently retire from my medical practice and pursue my other interests, like writing and working on filmmaking. So it turns out there were at least half a dozen productions made about the Thai cave rescue, but probably 4 primary ones: the Jimmy Chin and Chai Vaslary documentary, The Rescue, made through National Geographic. And I think that's probably the best representation of the factual account, and most of us were interviewed for that, and there was some recreations, but also some footage from the Thai Navy SEALs of the real cave and the rescue. So I always tell people, I think if you want the most accurate account, that's the one to watch. There was also a Netflix documentary called The 13 Trapped, which basically interviews the kids and their parents and a lot of the ties. And so if you want to get the kids' perspective on the rescue, for me, that's the best factual account. And then you've got these two narrative accounts, the 13 Lives, Ron Howard film, which Craig and I weren't directly involved with, and the Netflix series that we were involved with. And I actually went to Thailand to do some diving work on the set there, and actually was the stunt double for the actor who was playing me. So I got to stunt double myself, which was fun and weird. But to answer your question in a very long-winded way, the 13 Lives one, obviously a high-quality film, amazing cast. I was very pleased with my representative in Joel Edgerton, who's a super cool guy. Wife actually has family in Adelaide where I live. So subsequently, I've got to meet Joel and his wife a few times, actually, at Christmas when they come over. And Joel is such a cool and nice, laid-back guy, very deep thinker, but a beautiful soul, really. He's really lovely. And so we chat occasionally. So that's a pretty cool friend to have made.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, it was fine. The Ron Howard film and the Netflix series, they're both, scripted accounts of what was, in my mind, a script that could not be improved upon. And so any slight deviation from the script I found a bit annoying, knowing what the truth was. So I'm probably, one of the cave divers is perhaps the wrong person to ask about those films. Did they do their job at portraying the drama and the tension? I guess they did, but it can never be as real as the actual drama and tension that was there. I mean, at the end of that rescue, I remember saying to Craig, you could not write a Hollywood script that could be better than what we've just experienced, right down to that very last moment when the pumps all failed and the cave started to flood and everyone went scurrying out of the cave with the water chasing us out. I mean, right down to the wire. It was dramatic. Apart from a lack of a car chase and a romantic interest and a villain, perhaps, it was all in there. So what can I say?
One of the moments that stuck out just from your little description there was in the film. They presented it as Richard Stanton and John Valanthan and everyone sort of trapped you into coming there just thinking, you were a diver and they weren't going to use your medical skills at all. And from what it sounds like you knew from the start that you might need to use your anesthesiologist sort of skills to help these kids out. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So that was a big
Deviation
from the truth, I guess, in that narrative. And I understand why they use that gimmick, just to build the tension. Like, okay, we'll get that guy over. He's a good diver and he's an anaesthetist. We'll just get him here, and then we'll kind of trick him into doing it. No, Rick was very open and in our conversations saying, look, I think you should come, but this is why I want you to come. And I would say, well, I want to come, but I ain't doing that. So, we were both at opposite sides of the argument at that moment, but I was very keen to get there, and so was Craig. Actually, we both had this interest in cave rescue. We felt it would be an amazing thing to be a part of. I mean, it was also an amazing adventure for us. I won't lie about that. But of course, when you actually get there and you realize, especially when you meet these children for the first time, what the stakes are, then gets very serious very quick. The only possible way I convinced myself to do the anesthesia technique was when I realized that the kids would die anyway. And so why not? You got to try something. You can't just leave them.
And I guess the process of convincing you that still happened in Thailand. So you've explained it pretty well. It was that or nothing.
Well, I really had to convince myself, to be honest.
Yeah.
If I decided that it was not the right thing, I wouldn't have done it. But when you're faced with the decision, which is A, let the kids die slowly, horribly, and have their skeletal corpses brought out in 3 to 6 months, or bring them out now, and if they die, at least they'll be asleep when it happens. In a way, it's a very simple choice if they are the only two options. So what do you do?
Well, it's that old medical to do no harm, but I get why it's such a moral conundrum. But then I guess once you think about it like that, it becomes a lot more. Here they have even if it's a small chance, as you said, they have a chance at least. I wanted to ask about once you get in the cave, because there's a little process you or Joel Edgerton's character goes through where like calming the kids down. I'd love to know from you how that went down, because just in my mind, being going back to my child days, I just don't know how I would have been able to be calm in that situation. And obviously you're getting put under. So once you're put under, you're calm and there's no real worries about that. But how did you approach it with these kids? Was it very similar to just kind of talking about football or different things with them and trying to get them just to trust you in a quick fashion, or how did the film get that completely wrong and you did it a little differently?
No, Joel did a pretty good job at that reenactment, and obviously the 4 British divers who were in there with me saw the routine 13 times, so they would have been able to give Joel pretty good advice about how I conducted that part of the mission. I guess I was fortunate in that I've worked a fair bit with kids in anesthesia, and so you have a bit of a patter, a bit of a routine, because to keep a child calm as they're going off to sleep is actually very important, not just for their well-being and for the parent or guardian's well-being, but also it affects them medically. If a child is very combative and is screaming their lungs out as they go to sleep, they often wake up in the same way, and that's not conducive to a good recovery or good healing or what have you. It makes things more painful for them. And so we take that part of it very seriously for a whole host of reasons, including medical ones. So you either become a reasonably good pediatric anaesthetist or you don't do kids, because very quickly you find you haven't got that knack. And until I had my own kids, I hated it. I couldn't understand how to talk to kids or relate to them. But once you've got your own children, even having had babies and know how to hold them, just makes you so much more comfortable. So I really enjoyed doing the work with kids, and the language barrier with myself and these Thai kids was almost complete. There was no overlap, but they can tell that you're just talking, nonsense, or your voice is calm. And I had the Thai doctor there, the Navy SEAL, Dr. Puck, who did speak quite good English. And so I'd be chatting away to the kid who's sitting on my knee saying, what position do you play? And I used to be a pretty great soccer player myself, all these sort of lies. And and the doctor would be kind of interpreting and saying to the kid, he's asking you about your soccer and what do you like doing? And so the doctor and myself were a pretty good combo. We worked a bit as a team for that part of it, with him relaying some of the rubbish I was talking about. So yeah, it was good.
100%.
And these kids, extraordinarily tough, courageous, resilient boys. I mean, that's the single biggest thing that I left the rescue with, is the absolute respect and admiration for the Thai people, and particularly these kids. So I think I've had a fairly tough upbringing, living on that border with Myanmar. I don't think life had always been easy for them or their families. And through that little bit of hardship, I think they'd built some toughness that served them, or, stood them in very good stead for this ordeal that lasted over 2 weeks.
Yeah, 100%. It that really shone through about the film, and one of the things I liked about the film is it really took a community to make this happen. Just even the people on the mountain, making sure the water doesn't go into the cave and things like that. But I guess the last few questions I'd have about the films would be, what were some things that you think they did really well, that were super accurate, and you were like, they did a good job with that, and I guess what were some of the bigger things that stood out that they did get wrong? If you could give maybe one or two examples, that'd be great.
It's been a few years since I watched them,
Years since
actually.
you've seen it.
So
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, different films had a different emphasis. One of the films had a huge emphasis on a guy called Tanet, who was the water engineer, and all the operations he did up in the mountains, diverting water away and advising where to do the drilling and pumping and all this sort of stuff. I think that emphasis was well deserved, and it didn't get much of a mention in some of the other films. There was a guy on the ground called Josh Morris, who was actually an American expat living in Chiang Rai, running a caving, climbing, and guiding business. Josh played a hugely important role as a kind of diplomatic go-between between the Western cave divers and the American Air Force guys and the Thai army, because he had a personal relationship with one of the Thai generals. So without him, I don't think the whole thing would have gelled in the way it did. We wouldn't have got the trust from the Thais to actually do what we needed to do. And I don't think Josh was really even mentioned in most of the films that I can recall. Certainly not given the credit that he was due. Yeah, I mean, you have to choose as a director or a producer. I guess you have to choose the characters who will best tell the story overall, the sort of greatest good for the greatest number. And so some people's roles won't be even mentioned. Some people's roles will be emphasized or de-emphasized. There was one woman who was an American Air Force captain, I think she was, who played quite a big role in one of the films. She, quite an attractive girl, and she became a spokesperson at one point. And I think her role in real life wasn't quite as big as what was portrayed. So there's all these different roles that were upscaled or downscaled to suit the script, and that's life in movie land.
It is life in movie land. I remember when I watched this film a few years back when it came out, and it just kind of instantly grabbed me. So and just made me want to learn more about this story. And I it was also a big reason why I started this podcast is I love chatting to people like you who can tell us about the real story behind it. Because as you know, and as I know, and as the audience knows, Hollywood loves Hollywoodizing movies. So it is an honor and a pleasure to chat with you, not only about Deeper, but about your role in the Thai cave rescue. And thank you for that as well. I'm sure you get thanked all the time, and it's sometimes unwanted, but I'm going to say it anyway. But my final question for you is one that I ask all my guests, and it's about film. I'd love to know about some films that you love, or some films you've watched recently that you'd love to share and recommend to the audience. If you're not a big film guy, that's okay. We can also do a book, but I just love getting recommendations from my guests as well.
Well, I am a bit of a film guy. I mean, I love some of the classics. I mean, I'm a big fan of James Cameron. In fact, I've been lucky enough to meet him and also interview him on my podcast, which is called Real Risk. If anyone's interested in my interviews with other risk takers from around the world, including Jimmy Chin and Alex Honnold, and some of the big well-known people who put themselves out there. The Abyss, James Cameron's film, The Abyss, was one of my all-time favorites, and I spoke at length to him on my podcast about how they did the liquid breathing scenes. If you've seen that film, where initially they put some rats in the perfluorocarbon pink liquid, and the rat has to start breathing the liquid underwater because the liquid contains lots of oxygen and the rat can breathe. And they genuinely did that with rats in this special liquid. And then they had Ed Harris. Was it Ed Harris? Yeah.
Yes, Ed Harris.
Who was the diver, and he had to do the liquid breathing, but they didn't actually make the actor do it. They faked that. So that was a great chat. So that's one of my all-time favorite films. Recently, after the last Academy Awards, Anora, I thought was spectacular. I really enjoyed that. Unfortunately, I've watched quite a few of these on planes recently on the smallest screen known to man, but that was brilliant. The Substance with Demi Moore was brutal,
Wow.
but I enjoyed it.
Yes, I've avoided it so far. So if you're recommending it, maybe I'll have to give it a go.
Brace yourself, Daniel, but
Okay.
it's terrific. I'm glad it was a small screen for that one. I think if that was in IMAX, I probably wouldn't have survived it.
Okay, watch on the smallest screens possible, but watch it.
No, look, I like lots of stuff from all sorts of genres.
That hit the spot. I really appreciate that, and I actually haven't watched The Abyss, so I will have to watch that. That's one of the few James Cameron films that I've avoided. Remember when I was growing up, I volunteered at a video rental store when we still had those back 10 years ago, or a little longer than that.
Yeah,
But
maybe more.
yeah, maybe more. But I remember being introduced to Terminator, and I was like, wow, James Cameron is something special. And then I also love Catherine Bigelow's movies, and I know they were together for a little bit, so I
Yeah.
guess the talent attracts talent. But yeah, thank you for the recommendations, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I heard you talk about your podcast, the Real Risk podcast. So if people do have a chance, I definitely would encourage them to go over there and listen to some of your interviews. I definitely will. I'm a big fan of Alex Honnold, and I'd love to listen to this interview with James Cameron. But before I let you go, is there anything else you'd like to tell people about? Anywhere that you'd like to send them to keep following your life? Are there any social medias or? things like that you'd like to share?
I'm a famously bad self-promoter, but yeah, I'm on the socials, Instagram and Facebook. I've got a couple of books out, but one, if people are interested in risk and that sort of stuff and adventure, I've got a book called The Art of Risk by Richard Harris, which actually is based on the podcast. So I use some of those stories to develop my own ideas about the importance of risk and risk taking, especially for young people, to try and combat this terrible global adolescent mental health epidemic that we're facing at the moment. So very important we get outside, get off our screens, and get a few bumps and scrapes is my mantra.
I 100% agree, Harry. And thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. And everyone, you know where to find him on Instagram and Facebook, and his book and his podcasts. And I feel like it's very easy to follow you now. You've gone from not wanting the attention to providing lots of content. So I love it. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. Great to chat.
So thank you everyone for joining us for this episode today. I felt like I could have talked to Harry for another hour, so I'm really grateful for his time. If you're in the Sydney area and want to go check out this film at the Sydney Film Festival, please do that. It is just a wonderful picture and definitely something that you want to see on the biggest screen possible. Thank you again to Harry for his time and his wonderful stories, and it was so great learning not only about Deeper but about 13 Lives as well, and how far from the truth it was, but how it still captured the spirit in some senses, and obviously Hollywoodized it. But that's why we do this podcast, so we can learn if a movie is really accurate or playing with it. So I really appreciate him coming on, and if you do get a chance to listen to his podcast, which is still up there for anyone to listen to, or if you have a chance to buy his book, The Art of Risk, then I would recommend that as well. For people who do want to suggest any other guests that we should have on or make any comments, you can leave a comment on Spotify now. You can also do that on social media. We appreciate the feedback and we love hearing from you. So until next time, we'll see you at the movies. Bye all.